Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the death of Pope Francis, Elon Musk's departure from DC, and sharp argument between Zelensky and the Trump administration over peace in Ukraine. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Pope Francis, the leader of the world's 1 billion Catholics, died on Easter Monday. Lots has been written about his departure. At Compact, we published Nathan Penkoski on Pope Francis's managerial revolution, describing how he helped to bring a new set of practices and a new set of priorities into the Catholic Church. I'm Catholic, as a lot of our listeners will know. Francis has been, one of the defining figures of, my own kind of intellectual and political life over the last decade plus, and a similarly influential figure, I think, across the world. Looking back, I guess, it's, I have to say, I feel a lot older than I did when he came in, and I think it's not just age. There was a real kind of increase in first rancor, and then I would say exhaustion in Catholic intellectual life over the course of Francis's papacy. There was something, I think, useful and clarifying about Francis's rise. He helped to reveal some of the limits of the conservative Catholic settlement that John Paul II and Benedict XVI, his predecessors, had brought about. And this was a settlement that really sought to embrace, but also to redirect the church's opening to the modern world that occurred in and around the Second Vatican Council. Unlike a lot of Catholic traditionalists, John Paul II and Benedict XVI really embraced the council and saw it as good and helpful. And they insisted that its fulfillment came not in kind of a ever-increasing liberalization of the church, but instead in a vision of the church that affirmed modern liberal democracy, affirmed pluralism, affirmed markets even. At moments, in the papacy, there was a greater opening to markets, though both John Paul II and Benedict XVI continued to offer incisive critiques of market economies and their corresponding ideologies. There was a greater openness to them than you got at some points in Catholic history. And there was, I think, really an energy and momentum behind that synthesis while there was still a Soviet menace. Because John Paul II in particular was able to explain how faith and freedom went together in opposing totalitarian systems like the one that prevailed in his native Poland. But the end of history, the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think, was bound to have kind of effect on the Catholic Church as it had elsewhere, and that kind of conservative liberal settlement in the church entered into a form of crisis that I think really came into view with Francis's election. He revealed a desire on the part of Catholic liberals to push farther. He showed that Catholic liberals had greater strength than I think conservatives had often recognized. And he revealed that there was a potential for kind of traditionalist reaction that a lot of people hadn't appreciated. Interest in the Latin Mass increased under him because a lot of people had a sense, or a lot of more conservative Catholics had a sense that, if the church was so much more readily liberalized than they had anticipated, maybe they needed a more thoroughgoing response to and rejection of modernity than they had previously contemplated. So there was a polarization, kind of a couple poles pulling away from each other. Lots more to say. Love to hear kind of Jeff and Ashley what your thoughts are on Francis at the moment of his passing.
Yeah, I thought it would be interesting to speak a bit to the fact of Francis being the first Latin American pope, which was significant historically, particularly with the kind of shifting center of gravity of the church towards the so-called global south in terms of numbers of congregants. Although this also coming at a time when the church in Latin America is facing challenges, particularly from rising Protestantism in many of its former strongholds. And so, he's an interesting figure in representing, again, that shifting center of gravity away from Europe. And as far as his own sort of politics, it did seem he was a very amenable pope to the kind of North Atlantic liberal consensus. But there are various ways in which his politics weren't. There you saw this just in the obituaries and coverage of recent days. It was all this kind of, it sort of celebrated his, in a kind of soft focus way, his sort of liberal instincts in terms of kind of social justice and the environment and things like that. But would also sort of remark, well, like, but he's staunchly traditionalist on sexuality and birth control and all those kinds of things. And so I think part of that kind of disconnect is he does represent a kind of politics that is relatively common in Latin America, but relatively uncommon in North America, which is essentially a kind of socially conservative sort of economic populism. He does come out of Argentina, which through the history of Peronism is kind of a stronghold of this type of politics, where although Perón himself was at odds with the church, and much of the Catholic Church in Argentina at the time was actually much more aligned with the kind of oligarchic traditional elite of the country. Nonetheless, he did, he and Evita sort of based a lot of their appeals on a kind of shared religious language and sensibility, and really were, able to channel a kind of popular Catholicism. So the point is, he comes out of that world. His politics, going back to when he was younger and living through the Argentine dictatorship, were a bit murky. I think I can't remember all the details, but he was accused of, to some extent, collaborating. I think he's accused of having informed on fellow Jesuits to the junta in the 1970s. So I think there's some controversy around that. It's worth noting that he was never within the context of Latin America, and the Jesuit order is another important thing here. The Jesuits have a history of being often quite, politically radical and at odds with the establishment. And, there's a long history here. People may have seen the popular movie The Mission, which covers an early episode of this. Really going back to colonial times, that there was the Jesuits were the part of the Catholic Church that was often, positioning itself as the kind of defender of the rights of the people, and particularly the sort of indigenous peoples, against the church. Now, this is too simple of a history, but nonetheless, this is kind of how it's often told. And within Argentina at the time of his younger years, there were Jesuits who were really, deeply immersed in sort of radical liberation theology, Marxism, and were aligned with essentially kind of terror. In fact, there was a left-wing terrorist organization which claimed the mantle of Peronism, which was also Catholic, right? Explicitly Catholic in Argentina. And this was one of the most significant sort of left-wing terrorist groups in the whole continent, and it was explicitly Catholic in the way it understood itself. So he wasn't, he was certainly not I think within that context, he was a relatively kind of conservative and establishment aligned figure. But nonetheless, he channels again this kind of fusion of social conservatism and economic populism that when it's kind of absorbed into the global north sort of media sphere just can become a kind of soft focus kind of generic liberalism, and he can be seen as kind of a comfortable and acceptable figure compared to a conservative like Ratzinger, who like Benedict, who preceded him. And so he's an interesting figure in this regard. It does seem that my outsider's impression is that he's somebody who kind of, and I think this echoes what Matthew said, is that he kind of restored a certain comfort with at least a version of the Catholic Church, which had been, I think I've gone on tangents about this before, but I wrote this long piece about the novels of Dan Brown, which 20 years before the movie Conclave, which is having a new wave of interest after Francis's death, was kind of, an extremely popular cultural product that was interested in both the Angels and Demons and the Da Vinci Code, which were interested in the kind of secret behind the scenes machinations of the Catholic Church. And, I think this sense of the institution as somehow kind of frightening and sinister was often, this is what the Da Vinci Code speaks to in its popularity, right? That the sense of it, which, partly comes out of, I think, the popular impact of the sex abuse scandal, which occurred really within a year or two before the Da Vinci Code was released and became like one of the best-selling novels of all time. And so I think Francis was kind of, on the PR front, he was somebody who kind of put a new face on the church and gave it a certain new veneer of respectability and acceptability in sort of mainstream Western context, when it had really been kind of orientalized and treated as this kind of really these older kind of Protestant tropes around the kind of sinister, secretive, foreign character of the Catholic Church had come to the fore through things like Dan Brown's novels. And so he, through this kind of openness and sort of soft populism, he was able to give it a kind of new PR, a kind of refresh the church's image. But at the same time, it also seems clear to me as an outside observer that, as Matthew was hinting at it, this also kind of exacerbated really deep tensions within it. And it's interesting also to see, particularly with this kind of rise of like, very online Catholic converts, sort of based in red pilled influencer types, is like, a lot of them would kind of virtue signal / vice signal by like trashing Francis as just, sort of libtard, a sort of cringe libtard, or like a sinister communist, which is what Javier Milei, the current president of Argentina, repeatedly calls him, the kind of world leader of communism and things like this. And so you would see these kind of people who like just converted last year to Catholicism suddenly like going for the jugular on Francis as just this, totally sinister communist, like gay race communist or whatever. And so, yeah, it's kind of fascinating that but I mean, that's the silly version, but obviously, Matthew brought up the Latin Mass, like he kind of brought out and exacerbated tensions within the church precisely through this kind of, relatively comfortable alignment with the kind of global Northwestern media sphere and political sphere. So those are just my superficial outsider observations.
So I was worried about speaking second because I had a feeling that I was a little off base in what I was going to say. And yeah, sure. And I was like, am I being too critical here? And Geoff, I'm about to be that person that's going to say the obvious thing. But no, it's not that he was the Pope of, the communist Pope and this sort of thing, but he was the Pope of global governance, right? That he represented this kind of questing for inclusion and this sort of thing, which is, global governance is obsessed with inclusion because nobody can escape the eye of surveillance, right? Everybody's behavior must be managed, must be observed, must be managed, this sort of thing. So, you don't want anyone out of your eye. And so it struck me when I started to see this going on with Francis. I started thinking, wow, religion has fallen too. That religion is, the church had long sort of abandoned um, abandoned the divine in favor of like the religion of health and this sort of thing. And this happened with COVID, when it was quite clear when they decided to sort of cancel or like just forget about doctrine and that sort of thing, that the real God was this sort of like health governance, this sort of thing. But I think, part of me wants to think about, why is this, why do I kind of feel this urge to defend the religion that Francis left behind? That when we made these comments about like environmentalism and Catholic sort of sinning against nature and this sort of thing, it signified this abandonment of the progressive kernel within monotheism, which is, obviously humanity went searching for what is great within himself, within ourselves. And since we couldn't realize that on earth, we projected it onto God. That's the sort of standard Marxist line, right? But that is, there's a progressive kind of pathway there where we begin to gradually realize or see this center humanity, that we stop becoming quite so thrown about by forces beyond our control. And if you go back to, Hegel talks about this in his lectures on the history of religion, where he talks about the forces of fate in ancient Greece were so powerful that even the gods were subject to it. Like not even the gods could escape fate, which reflected, the extent of humanity at the time. They were writing their culture onto religion, onto the gods. That the powers of fate, earthquakes, famine, this sort of thing, this defined the reality of the ancient world. And it was such a powerful limitation that even the gods were subject to it. And as we move towards sort of monotheism, we have this sort of, all-powerful God that reflects a kind of grasping of humanity to overcome nature, overcome fate. That God suddenly can overcome fate. And, that was us sort of gradually kind of realizing our own humanity. So there was something, when people take refuge in religion now, I think they are taking refuge in the last place where humanity, ironically, was central, that put man at the core of the universe. And to abandon that for the sort of pagan neo-religion of environmentalism strikes me as an extraordinary step back for humanity. And for the head of the Catholic Church to have done that, I found really profoundly worrying. Because, if you think about like Marx in his famous critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, where he talks about, religion is the opiate of the people. He says, well, he begins that by saying the critique of religion in Germany is almost complete. This is now we have a new kind of, because religion gave a kind of false equality. It said, I know on earth we're not all equal, but in the eyes of God, we are all equal. And I think that's what people are taking refuge in to a certain extent. But beyond that, now we have even bigger kind of illusions and delusions, which is, in the eyes of, I don't know, the state. Okay, in life, I know, we are not all equal. But in the eyes of the state, we are all equal. Okay, well, we know that's not true. Maybe that's not true. But in the eyes of the environment, we're all equal. We're equally horrible, destructive, disastrous, horrible little creatures. And that is a terrible equality. This is like some far worse illusion. An opiate, doesn't even give you any nice feelings. At least an opiate makes you feel nice for a little while. This is like euthanasia. This is an ideology of humanity that has become so nihilistic and so has lost so much hope over the future and has destroyed so much its essence as God. as this powerful creature that could bring life to other planets and could overcome nature, could bend fate to his will. And I think Francis kind of represented a little bit of that death.
It's just so fascinating. I never thought I would hear a cogent kind of Marxist critique of a pope's liberalism, and without necessarily. I mean, I have a different perspective than Ashley, so without necessarily taking it all on board, I do want to mention one thing that resonates a bit with what she's describing. Relatively early on in Francis's pontificate, he brought out a document called Amoris Laetitia. I remember the British writer Tim Stanley joking when this came out that it sounded like the name of a Roman slave girl in a kind of trashy film. But he came out with this document, Amoris Laetitia, and in it, he kind of fudged the classic Catholic teaching that those who are divorced and remarried cannot receive communion because by Catholic doctrine, marriage lasts until death. So if you're theoretically married to this initial person and you've left that person and are now married to another, you are living in sin, as it was once called. Obviously, that's kind of harsh. It can be seen as harsh and judgmental. It's certainly a hard teaching, difficult for many people, and there are plenty of kind of formal ways that the church finds to scoot out of that pretty liberal application of annulments, this, that, the other thing. Annulment is as much as to say the first marriage never happened. So there are kind of Jesuitical ways around it. But Francis went a step further and kind of fudged the whole teaching. One thing that I felt about that was that it did kind of diminish human agency in a way by making acts matter less. Before you could kind of take a step that would, the whole tendency of the Francis pontificate at times seemed to be to make it so that no step would actually alienate you from God. And now the promise of Christianity is always that alienation can be overcome, that forgiveness can be offered, but there is a sense that every act matters, and I think that was weakened a bit, which maybe echoes with some of what Ashley's saying. Penkovsky mentioned in his piece for us that there were moments in Francis's critique of our technological culture that he really seemed to be to have hit on a rich vein of kind of almost older kind of anti-liberal Catholic polemic. But then when that was just coordinated with the imperatives of the kind of NGO kind of environmental blob, became less distinctive, less compelling, and seemed stultifying rather than freeing. Certainly for me as a Catholic, the COVID pandemic was very, very dispiriting. I've discussed this on the podcast before, so I won't go into it, but just the suspension of sacraments, very dispiriting. I did write a year or two ago, and I think this is a bright point in Francis's political life. The Pope is not just a spiritual figure; he's a political figure. He runs a sovereign state, even if a rather vestigial one. He has diplomatic recognition all over the world. A bright point in his political life, I think, was his stance on the Ukraine war, and there he really resisted the strong pressure he received within the church and outside the church to take an absolutely pro-Ukrainian stance. Now, I think that such a stance, is reasonable and fair up to a point, but I think Francis correctly intuited that his role as the Bishop of Rome was to seek mediation and peace, and there was something potentially profoundly destructive in kind of offering a ecclesial blessing to a kind of Western crusade against the repressive Russian regime. Now, whatever one makes of that, I think that there's just a certain danger in kind of enlisting the church in that project. So, his call for negotiation for peace, I think a lot of people rejected that. They saw it as lacking moral clarity, but I think he had sound intuitions. So the Trump administration is pushing hard for a ceasefire agreement, an effective peace agreement that more or less freezes the conflict in place, grants U.S. recognition of Russia's seizure of Crimea, which occurred during the Obama administration, and clarifies that the U.S. does not intend to bring Ukraine into NATO. Zelensky has called this settlement totally unacceptable, has rejected it, and the Trump administration is signaling that it may be ready to walk away from Ukraine, which presumably means withdrawing the forms of support that have been so essential to it, not just sharing armaments, but sharing intelligence, which is really essential to the Ukrainian effort against Russia. That's really the lever the Trump admin has. They say, you need to sign a deal or we'll walk away. So they're making that threat publicly.
Is it a threat though, or is it a safety valve, or no, an escape route? Is it an escape route? Because that's what it seemed like to me. Is that just too obvious a thing to say, that they're looking for a pretext to walk away? Trump made
They
all
just won out. They just won out. You're saying,
yeah,
basically.
they made all these big promises that he obviously couldn't make good on. And so, they have to, he's like, well, I thought it was going to be easier to deal with Zelensky, but, it wasn't. But I don't care who wins. There's a deal on the table. The deal on the table is obviously completely, Zelensky's, totally unfair to, well, I don't know. I'm not going to pull a Trump. I haven't got a dog in this fight, but it appears that Ukraine is not going to take that. It seems to be heavily weighted in favor of Russia. So what are they? It seems to me that this is a deal that can't really be accepted. But Trump has plausible deniability. He can say, "Look, we had a deal. Zelensky walked out. It's his fault."
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, I mean, the problem for Ukraine is that the battlefield has been tilted in favor of the Russians. They've been more successful than the Ukrainians. Now that could change if the U.S. promised, if the U.S. offered, tighter military integration. If we moved closer to boots on the ground, I mean, there are things that could obviously change the balance of forces, but one difficulty in figuring out what a kind of balance or rightly weighted peace agreement is just the seeming reality that the facts on the ground are in Russia's favor.
Yeah, but they've got the EU, right? So, Ukraine's not necessarily, relying, they just pledged like unwavering support again, recently. So, and the EU is they've got this chance to realize their dream, I keep saying, of this European army, European military. There's no reason. He's not as desperate as.
Yeah. So your sense is that there's, a fair amount, it's fairly realistic for the EU to help step in and pick up some of the slack left by the US.
Yeah, I mean, they're claiming it's peacekeeping, right? Like, because they don't want to start World War III. But, Starmer's promised boots on the ground. The framing is they have to be very careful with, but the EU is desperate. They want it. They really want to fight. And I think they will.
Yeah, well, if they can do that, I don't see why Zelensky would have any reason to do what the Trump administration is asking.
Yeah, I do wonder, it does seem connected to this whole sort of trade imbroglio that is the, remains the kind of biggest story at the moment, which, is connected in terms of this broader question of like, can the US somehow create a united front of the world against China? And the overall impression I have is, the way they've approached both this conflict and Europe. I mean, in theory, I've seen the idea floated that, basically there's a kind of that Trump's posture towards Russia is a kind of reverse Nixon to China. we published a piece by Benjamin Young a few weeks ago about the fact that, it was about the alliance between North Korea and Russia, but about the fact that, despite what we've been seeing, there is actually a great deal of mistrust between Russia and China, and that the idea of them becoming a kind of permanent, multipolarity bro alliance is actually a lot more tenuous than it might seem to the outside observer. And I think Young is, somebody who's credible on this front. And so if the idea is to kind of peel away these powers that are, somewhat aligned with China, but have their own grievances and suspicions about China, then Russia is kind of a big, trying to create some kind of friendlier relation with Russia would be a big part of that. But it's interesting that that's actually going along with this seemingly unrelenting hostility to Europe. And there was this extremely dumb article in The Nation a few weeks ago that was like, Europe is everything Trump hates. It's like a Ivy League college campus except a whole continent or something, and it's progressive, pro DEI, blah blah blah. Very dumb. But it almost strikes me that like the Trump administration actually sort of seems to think that about Europe. So like that does seem to actually be how they think about Europe. But the point I was going to make is that clearly this is kind of in tension with the this goal of trying to create and strengthen alliances so as to weaken China's hand on the global stage, both economically and in the future militarily. And so I don't know. I'm sort of interested in how this sort of geopolitical gambit connects to the economic, sort of global trade, economic gambits that they're making in the trade war. And it seems all very difficult, and it seems all very difficult to pull off. And another sort of interesting point is that the European or the Eastern European, like the parts of the EU that are most amenable to, I'm thinking of like parts of Eastern Europe, not Poland, but places like Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, in terms of at least the preferences of the electorate as revealed in this canceled election. There's quite a bit of desire to achieve a working peace with Russia. But these are also the parts of Europe that are most vulnerable to any attempt to kind of drive a wedge between Europe and China. That in fact, Hungary is actually, very economically integrated with China, for example. So I'm only expressing here that this seems like just an incredibly difficult, set of geopolitical tasks that this administration has set itself in terms of, attempting to forge some kind of new, or reimagine the relationship with Russia on a new footing, and to, forge new alliances that will enable a kind of partial marginalization of China, bring about a resolution to this war. And I have to say, I'm not convinced that the people running the show have the capacity to pull any of this off at all, based on what's been going on in the past few weeks. It's really, quite, because I think if you, I'm not sure who the sort of master of diplomacy is supposed to be right now. Like, I think you have, somebody we've covered in Compact, like Elbridge Colby, who's, a very impressive and serious thinker, and I think is, kind of positioning himself as a sort of Kissinger figure for this generation. But if you look at what's going on at the top of the Pentagon, not to mention the incredible sort of disaster that seems to be unfolding in the kind of trade realm. And then if you look to what the State Department is doing, it does not. It seems to me that there's like an extremely complicated dance underway here, and I'm not confident that the people in charge are capable of pulling this off at all.
I am, however, confident. So here's where I agree with Trump. I am confident that whenever they keep talking about 4D chess, I'm like, Trump's not playing 4D chess. Trump is in over his head. But Putin is playing 4D chess. I don't doubt that. Like he's got the whole benefit of the Cold War under his belt. You know, what has Trump got? The art of the deal that was ghostwritten by some guy. I do think that Putin probably knows what he's doing. And has got, obviously the US eating out of the palm of his hand. But maybe that's too obvious a thing to say. But one of the big concerns is like that with such significant concessions, Putin is going to be emboldened, right? He's, essentially he gets what he invaded for, right? But one of the big things that everyone keeps saying is like, well, anybody who's sort of a skeptic of the whole idea of carrying this war on, the thing that got people behind it was, we must stop Putin now. I mean, does he actually have dreams of world domination? Because sort of bigging that up seems to be one of the rationales for increasing pressure and trying to ensure that it has been the rationale to keep this war going, that Putin gets nothing because, well, what's he going to take next? The whole Putin is Hitler narrative. And I think that's highly unlikely. On the other hand, the last time I heard the word bluster, it's all bluster, it's just bluster, was before Putin invaded Ukraine. And that was supposedly all bluster. So, you never know what I do believe that Putin is a smart guy and that he may, be up to more than, I don't know, than people might realize.
I do think what we're being confronted with right now is just the question of, all right, what's the end game in Ukraine? What's the way out? And I think Trump has a very clear idea of what the end game is. It is a negotiated settlement that basically uh, recognizes de facto, if not in every case de jure, the facts on the ground, given where the battlefield now stands. Um, it's interesting that Putin has signaled some openness to accepting this agreement. Maybe he figures he's got what he wanted, and that Zelensky is more likely to resist. I mean, if the war drags on, my perception is that it won't work out hugely to the advantage of the Ukrainians, especially if the U.S. pulls out. Europeans may step in, but do they really have the capacity in terms of intelligence gathering and weapons support to replace the U.S., especially given their continuing dependence on the U.S.? They are themselves susceptible to what the U.S. says. So, I think that Trump is showing statesmanship here by pushing for a settlement, whether or not the details are correct or the approach he's taken is going to succeed. That I simply don't know. But the basic conclusion that we need to find a way to get the various actors to recognize the facts on the ground, rather than continuing to prosecute a war, which I don't see really becoming more favorable to the Ukrainian side. I think that's the right approach.
That would actually put the US in the best position, the position that they've managed to get themselves into for both world wars, which is that you stay out of direct combat and you supply the weapons. That's what they managed to do. They managed to stay out of it for a very, very long, stay out of these conflicts for a very, very long time and profited from manufacture. Smart.
Right. I believe that Trump has reopened the question of whether or not Britain owes us money for armaments we supplied them under Lend-Lease. And I don't know whether he's got into this, and I don't know the legal status of it, but I believe we also supplied a baffling quantity of armaments to the Soviet Union during World War II. and I would love to see the topic of payment for that broached. Yeah, so kind of settle the war, whatever, and before we unfreeze all Russian assets, just say, we're taking, we're taking the bulk of this as payment for whatever we gave Stalin. So I think this is kind of buried in the Cold War, but we did a huge amount to build them up just a few years before we decided they were our enemies. So he was kind of the original Osama bin Laden in that way. Speaking of widely hated figures, Elon Musk. He says he's leaving DC and returning, not to the plow and his farm like Cincinnatus, but instead to Tesla, where he's going to address some of the worries of his shareholders. So I think it's a good moment to just ask, what has Musk accomplished through Doge and through his broader kind of alliance with Donald Trump?
So I would say the things he's accomplished are political. He has not, as far as I understand, you can see these graphs of like spending and the fact that basically if you look at the charts, there's like no appreciable change in the budget. The things the cuts that he's been able to make are a small change and are essentially canceled out by increasing interest rates, and payment, thus, canceled out by the increasing share of revenues that have to be spent on payments on the debt. So, I think on the economic front of government efficiency, which was kind of framed as his remit, he's essentially accomplished nothing at all. It's all completely fake. It's a kind of weird spectacle. But he has done, very notable things politically, and I'd point to two. I mean, the first that I think is significant here is that this is the first time that you have someone who's the major donor of a president actually inserting himself into public politics and making himself a kind of center of attention, which I think on one level makes very little sense. I mean, there's a lot of sort of good reason that historically donors have sort of tried to stay behind the scenes. Like, that you can't imagine, you can't imagine like the Koch brothers or somebody like that having, just like installed themselves in the White House under George W. Bush. It's just bizarre. And so, this is kind of a shift where there's some kind of sense, I think and the way I would read this in part is that it's related to some kind of larger crisis of political representation where, historically there are these kind of organized forms and structures within which different groups in society, are represented and have themselves represented in the political process. And what you have is this kind of disintermediation by which, instead you have a donor kind of directly representing himself, where, there's kind of this collapse of intermediary structures. And as we've seen this crisis in the Republican Party play out, whereby, it was essentially unable to prevent this, what was initially a hostile takeover by Donald Trump. And then, the various different kind of forces within the party have, in various ways either surrendered and retreated, as I think is often, it has often been the case for the forces of particularly social conservatism, one of the legs of or religious conservatism, one of the legs of the old fusionist stool, where you saw like in the RNC, when they drew up the party platform last year, essentially the social conservatives were, or religious conservatives were sort of humiliated and forced into this posture of just accepting this platform that marginalized their concerns. And then you have, the sort of traditional ways that essentially billionaires and the business class kind of represented their interests, also being, again, kind of forced into a certain subservience. Um, and and then but then you have someone like Musk who chooses to just kind of avoid all of those kind of structures and just insert himself directly in this process. So I think that's very significant. You could see various kind of precursors of this. The rise of Michael Bloomberg as a kind of Democratic power player, both as a kind of donor, but also then as a candidate, was maybe one sort of preliminary, version of this kind of disintermediation, whereby billionaires just kind of represent themselves directly. Kind of direct democracy for billionaires or something like that. But then, I mean, the other interesting thing about Musk is that he's not running for office, right? He's kind of attaching himself to this candidate, joining himself at the hip to this candidate, inserting himself into a very public role. But he's not running for office nor taking on any really clear official position, as say someone like a billionaire like Rex Tillerson did in the first Trump administration briefly. And not because he was a donor, but because there was kind of this idea that, he's a competent manager because he's a CEO of a major corporation. And so this is, it's a very distinctive role he carved out for himself. So that's point one. The second point would be, I think this, this project of kind of wrecking the administrative state is obviously very, very significant. And it, I think it's been interesting just to see the process by which that's being done, and how, on one hand, there's this kind of spectacle aspect to it, where it seems as if the actual kind of dollars and cents involved are very minimal, even though that's how it's justified. And instead, it's this kind of pure kind of class-based, it really did come across as a kind of revolutionary project, right? Whereby this hostile force kind of occupied these sites of government. And, again, there's kind of a lack of clarity about what that will actually mean in terms of the functioning of the state, but it did express this kind of aggressive hostility toward, and manifest and kind of bring about this aggressive hostility towards government bureaucrats, and kind of this project of kind of putting them in their place, I think is very, is very significant. I mean, as a spectacle for one thing, but also as a political project. And I think where it actually goes is a little bit, I mean, that perhaps they shouldn't. I think they have achieved certain things, obviously. They may be kind of overestimating the extent of that, but nonetheless, as a sort of political enterprise and a sort of, in a way, sort of revolutionary political spectacle, I think it's extremely significant, and probably one of the most significant things that has happened politically in my lifetime.
So for me, I feel like Musk represents this kind of, what you said was interesting. You said that there's this kind of crisis of political representation. And I think that's true. I think that Musk represents this kind of crisis, a jostling for positioning, and an attempt to enlist the working class on one side or the other, but for entirely different reasons, and through completely different lenses, between what was left of that old ruling class, of the old bourgeoisie, the old industrial bourgeoisie, the capitalists as they were, the risk takers, the entrepreneurs, the industrialists, which are sort of fading away in favor of an ascendant class of professionals who had really been at the reins of power for a very, very long time, and who had a much more kind of quasi-feudal relationship. I don't want to sort of like go too much into sort of like neo-feudalism thesis, but nonetheless they had this ideal of care for a sort of peasantified working class, a working class that had been reduced in their status. And so they had this sense of, well, our responsibility is simply to care, and the government will increasingly take the place of work, the place that work once did, and will care for people as they get spat out the system. And Musk kind of represented the last hurrah of that sort of classical bourgeoisie, trying to sort of recapture the spirit of the Industrial Revolution, imagining colonizing Mars, rockets, electric cars, tunnels, techno-utopian visions, this kind of thing. But what he winds up producing, very interestingly, so they're like, well, let's try to do this. Let's have another industrial revolution. And then they're kind of confronted with the reality of why that managerial class had become so powerful, why the spirit of ingenuity and so on had been so tamed. That it wasn't that it was tamed by the regulations, but the regulations became a justification for a taming that was already happening. That is that an impossibility of further growth. These barriers that were being put up all over the place, which had little to do with what the managerial class was doing, was sort of acquiescing to a slowdown that was already happening. And so they try to push back against this, and what they wind up producing is just the same thing that old class was producing in the first place, which was, oh, well, why don't we sort of get business to run government? Oh, we said this before. Wow, that's a novel idea. That's what's been going on for like 30 years. And then the state becomes this sort of regulatory apparatus, and that it just sort of becomes more and more hollowed out. That's what's been going on. So they wound up with all these visions and all these promises and all this hope. They wind up reproducing the same kind of neoliberal managerialism. And that is really, really scary, actually. It reminded me a little bit like the way that it's like, oh, the markets have reacted really badly against Trump. It reminded me of Liz Truss. And her, in the UK, this sort of like attempt to be like, we're going to do something big and great here. And the markets like reacted so poorly, they had to backtrack on it. And that's quite scary. Like that basically tells you, regardless of how smart these economic plans were, regardless of whether or not Trump was right in tariffs or Liz Truss was right in her economic policy, the fact that you actually can't democratically try to do something huge and overhaul the system, and you will be disciplined by the markets, is something that's quite scary, actually. That means that we really don't have control, and it is very much laid bare here. Trump clearly, he starts rolling back on all these different things, and he doesn't want to be the president that tanked the economy. He's willing to be the president that did insider trading or something like that and be accused of insider trading and like, oh yeah, this was all part of the plan and loads of people made lots of money, da da da. He'd rather that than be the one who tanked the economy. So he has to kind of backtrack. They all have to backtrack. Musk has to sort of retreat as well in the face of reality. And that is actually a really scary position to be in. Now, of course, there's probably another side to this that is far less world historical, which is that if Musk stays in government for too long, he's going to have to start submitting like his financials, which he probably doesn't want to do. And that's part of this sort of exit strategy. But I think the incredible failure of such a visionary experiment, let's do this, let's have another industrial revolution, speaks volumes to the stalemate that we're in right now, that the stalemate that we're in now democratically, politically, and economically.
We'll see how Trump's tariff initiative works. I have serious reservations about the way it's been conducted up to this point. After Trump's election, but before his inauguration, I wrote a column for the New York Times urging him to give a top economic role to Robert Lighthizer, his trade czar from the first term. Lighthizer is not currently in the administration. One reason I said we needed Lighthizer was because he has a history of working across party lines and within institutions to build consensus for a workable trade policy. And I think we've really seen the lack of that in Trump's tariff policy as it's been implemented so far in his second term. but I mentioned the tariff policy because there are big questions about whether or not it'll work. And if it doesn't work out so well, if Trump has to backtrack and whatever effects it has are judged to be, more bad than good. If it's really less successful than the trade reorientation Trump's first term, I think that'll suggest a real limit that the realignment vision for the Republican Party encountered, and its kind of vision for how the GOP can be used to improve the country. We're going to use tariffs. We're going to reorient the party in this on this working class vision. There will be a failure there that has to be reckoned with, and it looks to me already like there's a failure on the kind of cost-cutting, more libertarian element of the Trump agenda that needs to be reckoned with, just because Doge hasn't accomplished much. Certainly, its ill effects don't look, I guess I'd say, hugely severe. I don't think they're going to, plunge the economy into chaos, or, that they've been, utterly disastrous. There was a time when Democrats were kind of rallying around these federal workers who were, probably in certain cases being foolishly removed from their jobs. But fundamentally, people just don't care that much. I think, things can get a little worse, but they're already pretty bad. Maybe it's the change isn't that noticeable. So I don't know how disastrous Doge has been, but I would say we've really seen the limits of a kind of libertarian futurist version of Trumpism just in Doge's failures. So I think it's very possible that will come out of Trump term two, looking at the more kind of populist, nationalist version of Trumpism and the more kind of tech right futurist vision of Trumpism, and saying, all right, neither really managed to succeed in getting what it was aiming at. Neither managed to really reorient or revive our politics, in the way Ashley's describing. And if that occurs, I think there'll be big questions to ask for the right. Whether or not those questions are asked will just depend on whether or not a Republican is elected after Trump. I'm not down with the Trump third term. Sorry, but so whatever, whoever's elected, if a Vance gets in after Trump, those questions will be buried. But if we have a Democrat in office 4 years from now, we'll see a soul searching just as profound as you're seeing now among Democrats. With that, thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Geoff. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe. Get everything written by our wonderful contributors. And we'll see you next week.